The laughter came before the rain. 14-year-old Peter Voss stood at the edge of the Kapuas River dock, his canvas bag slung across one shoulder, while 3 men from the Hendrick Trading Company loaded the last of their supplies onto a narrow longboat. The expedition leader, a red-faced Dutchman named Groeneveld, had just told him he was not coming. "Your ballast," Groeneveld said, loud enough for the Dyak porters to hear. "Dead weight. Your uncle paid me to take you upriver, but I won't risk good men nursing a boy who can't swing a machete without cutting his own foot." Someone laughed. The surveyor's assistant, a young man named Decker, who had once borrowed Peter's compass without returning it. Peter said nothing. He watched the river. Brown water moved in slow coils past the dock pilings, carrying leaves and the pale belly of a dead fish. The air was 92 degrees and thick as wet cotton. "Leave the boy his share of rice," Groeneveld told the cook. "He can wait here for the mail steamer. 3 weeks, maybe 4. They left him 6 pounds of rice, a tin of Dutch butter gone soft in the heat, a machete with a loose handle, and a hammock with a tear along one seam. They did not leave him quinine. They did not leave him a mosquito net. Peter watched the longboat round the bend, Decker's laughter still carrying across the water. Then he picked up the machete, tested its edge against his thumb, and turned away from the dock toward the green wall of jungle that began 40 yards from the trading post. He had no intention of waiting 3 weeks for a mail steamer that might not come at all. The trading post at Nanga Pino was 4 wooden buildings and a dock, staffed by an elderly Chinese shopkeeper named Lim, who sold tobacco, salt, and kerosene to the Dyak longhouse communities scattered along the upper Kapuas tributaries. Lim watched Peter sort through his bag on the shop veranda and said nothing for a long time. "You going into the forest?" Lim finally asked. "Yes, sir." "You know what's in there?" Peter looked up. He had a thin, sun-darkened face and steady gray eyes that made people forget he was only 14. "Trees," he said. "Water. Things I can learn." Lim sold him a half-pound of salt, a coil of rattan cord, and a small bottle of iodine tincture, all for the 2 guilders his uncle had sewn into his shirt hem. It was everything Peter had in the world. Lim also gave him, free of charge, a piece of advice. "Build high," the old shopkeeper said. "Everything that kills you in this jungle comes from below." Peter spent the first day walking. He followed a tributary stream southeast, away from the river settlements, cutting through undergrowth where no trail existed. The canopy closed overhead like a cathedral ceiling. 150 feet of layered green that swallowed the sky and turned midday into permanent dusk. The air beneath was still and heavy, 88 degrees in the shade, and the humidity pressed against his skin like a living thing. He was looking for elevation. His uncle, a failed rubber planter who drank too much but had once been a decent surveyor, had taught Peter one reliable principle. In a jungle, water is both life and death. You need it close, but you must sleep above it. Mosquitoes breed in standing water. Floods come without warning. Snakes hunt the water's edge at night. By late afternoon, Peter found what he was looking for. A limestone ridge rising 30 feet above the floodplain, studded with ironwood trees whose root buttresses fanned out like walls. At the ridge's base, a seep spring trickled from a crack in the rock, clear and cold. He tasted it carefully. No mineral bitterness, no sulfur smell. Clean. He hung his torn hammock between two buttress roots, ate a handful of raw rice softened in stream water, and listened to the jungle settle into its night chorus, the rising drone of cicadas, the crack-crack of a barking gecko, the distant cough of something large moving through undergrowth. He did not sleep well. The hammock swung with every shift of his weight, and the tear let mosquitoes find his left ankle. By morning, he had 7 bites swelling into red welts, and his back ached from the awkward hang. But he was alive, and the ridge was dry, and the spring still ran clear. He decided to stay. Building began on the 2nd day and did not stop for 3 months. Peter had watched Dayak builders at the longhouses downriver. He had filled a small notebook, his uncle's cast-off surveyor's field book, with sketches of their techniques, the way they split bamboo into flat planks by scoring and levering, the angle at which they laid palm thatch so rain would sheet off rather than soak through, the lashings they used that tightened when wet instead of loosening. He had never built anything larger than a rabbit hutch, but he had watched carefully, and watching carefully was the only advantage he had ever possessed. The ridge gave him a natural platform 8 feet above the floodplain. He chose a space between 3 ironwood trees, whose trunks formed a rough triangle, each side about 12 feet long. Using the machete, whose handle he reseeded and wrapped with rattan on the first morning, he cut bamboo from a dense stand in the gully below. Green bamboo, freshly cut, was heavy with moisture and prone to splitting. He learned this the hard way when his first load cracked overnight. After that, he cut the culms and stood them upright against the ridge face for 4 days, letting them begin to dry before working them. The platform came first. He lashed horizontal bamboo poles between the 3 ironwoods at waist height, then laid split bamboo planking across them, leaving narrow gaps between each plank, a 1/4 inch, no more, so air could move upward through the floor. The Dayak builders did this. It kept the sleeping surface ventilated and allowed debris to fall through rather than collect. The roof took 2 weeks. He cut it steep, nearly 50 degrees of pitch, because Lim was right about what killed you in the jungle, and the old shopkeeper's advice extended to rain. A shallow roof held water. Water bred mold. Mold rotted thatch. Rot brought collapse. A steep pitch shed water fast, and the overhang he extended 3 feet beyond the platform's edge kept rain from driving sideways onto the floor during storms. For thatch, he used the broad leaves of the sago palm, layered in overlapping rows from bottom to top, each row tied to a horizontal bamboo batten. It was tedious, methodical work: cut, carry, trim, tie, repeat, and his hands blistered, cracked, and bled before calluses formed. He recorded the process in his notebook. April 3rd, 40 leaves laid today, blisters on right palm opened, packed with river clay and bound with cloth strip, must cut left-handed tomorrow. The walls he left partially open. 3 sides had waist-high bamboo screens for privacy and wind protection, but the 4th, facing the ridge and the prevailing afternoon breeze, remained open. This was not laziness. Peter had noticed that the air moving over the limestone was measurably cooler than the surrounding jungle air. The rock, shaded by canopy and kept moist by the seep spring, acted as a kind of natural cooling surface. When the afternoon breeze passed over it and entered the shelter, the temperature inside dropped noticeably. He estimated 5 or 6 degrees below the ambient jungle temperature, though he had no thermometer to confirm it. He built the floor 3 feet higher than the surrounding ground. He dug a drainage trench around the platform's base, angling it to carry rainwater away from the ridge face and into the gully. He hung his food, the dwindling rice plus wild fruits and smoked fish he was learning to catch, in a bamboo basket suspended from a high crossbeam by a length of rattan cord greased with rendered animal fat so ants could not climb it. It was not comfortable. It was not beautiful. But by the end of April 1923, Peter Voss had a dry, ventilated, elevated shelter with clean water 10 paces away and a food cache that nothing had yet managed to raid. He was 15 years old in May. The first wet season nearly killed him. It began in October with a rainstorm that lasted 9 days without stopping. The river below the ridge swelled from a gentle stream to a brown torrent 40 feet wide, swallowing the gully where he cut bamboo and turning the floodplain into a shallow lake. Water crept up the ridge face. Peter lay on his platform and watched it rise, calculating whether the 3 feet of elevation he had built would be enough. It was. Barely. The water peaked 18 inches below his floor planks, then slowly receded over 3 days, leaving behind a skin of gray mud and the sharp smell of rot. But the water brought other things. Peter woke on the 11th night to a sound he had never heard before, a dry, sustained rustling, like someone dragging a canvas bag across bamboo. He lit his makeshift lamp, a coconut shell filled with rendered fish oil, and a twisted cotton wick, and held it over the edge of the platform. The ground below was moving. Dozens of snakes, reticulated pythons, green pit vipers, and the banded kraits he had learned to fear most had been driven from the flooded lowlands onto the ridge. They coiled among the ironwood roots, draped over fallen branches, and pressed against the base of his platform, seeking the dry ground and the warmth of the limestone. One krait, slender and black and white banded, had climbed a root buttress and was testing the air with its tongue 3 feet from Peter's sleeping mat. He did not panic. His uncle, for all his failures, had taught him that panic was the one luxury a jungle could not afford you. Peter pulled his legs onto the center of the platform, tucked his hammock around his feet, and sat very still, holding the lamp steady. The snakes did not want him. They wanted dry ground and warmth. His elevated platform was above most of them, and the gaps in the bamboo planking, those 1/4-inch gaps he had copied from the Dayak builders, were too narrow for anything but the smallest species to pass through. He sat awake until dawn. By morning light, he counted 31 snakes on the ridge, including a reticulated python he estimated at 14 feet long, coiled in a muscular heap against the base of the largest ironwood. Over the next 3 days, as the floodwaters receded, the snakes dispersed back into the lowland jungle. The krait that had climbed the root buttress slipped away sometime before noon, leaving a faint track in the mud. Peter wrote in his notebook, October 22nd. Flood drives snakes to high ground. Platform elevation and tight floor gaps proved sufficient. Must add bamboo screens at base to further discourage climbing. The shelter works because it is high and because it breathes. The snakes confirmed it. Word traveled along the river, the way it always does in a jungle. The Dayak traders who paddled past the ridge in November told Lim at the trading post that the Dutch boy was still alive. Lim told a mission teacher named Father Janssen, who paddled upstream in December to see for himself. Janssen found Peter smoking fish over a raised clay hearth, another Dyak technique, modified, with his notebook open beside him, recording the drying times of different species. Groeneveld told everyone you were dead, Janssen said, sitting on the platform's edge and accepting a cup of boiled stream water. Said the jungle would finish you in a week. It's been 9 months, Peter said. Janssen looked around the shelter, the tight thatch, the ventilated floor, the drainage trench, the hanging food cache, the clay hearth with its bamboo smoke hood that drew smoke upward and out through a gap in the roof peak. He was a practical man who had lived in Borneo for 20 years, and he recognized competence when he saw it. The floor gaps, he said. For the snakes? For the air, Peter corrected. The snakes were an accident, but they proved the design. Janssen asked if he could bring a colleague, a Dutch physician named Dr. Henrik Maas, who was studying tropical fevers at the mission hospital in Sintang. Peter agreed. Maas arrived in January 1924 with a thermometer, a hygrometer, and the first real interest anyone had shown in what Peter was building. Maas measured the temperature inside the shelter at 81 degrees Fahrenheit on an afternoon when the surrounding jungle floor registered 89. The humidity inside was 12% lower than outside. The doctor sat on the platform for an hour, making notes, and then told Peter something that changed the trajectory of his life. Every fever ward I've built in Borneo fails because the air inside is hotter and wetter than the air outside, Maas said. Patients cook in their own sweat. Your shelter reverses it. The limestone, the ventilation, the elevation. You've built a cooling system using nothing but bamboo and attention. Peter was quiet for a moment. I just didn't want to be hot, he said. Maas laughed, the first real warm laugh Peter had heard in nearly a year, and offered him a job. Over the next 2 years, Peter worked with Dr. Maas to build 3 ventilated shelters along the upper Kapuas tributaries, each designed as a recovery station for fever patients who could not make the journey downriver to Sintang. The design evolved with each iteration. Peter learned to orient the open wall toward the prevailing breeze in each location, to use the specific rock formations available, limestone where he could find it, river clay packed against bamboo frames where he could not, and to adjust the floor height based on local flood records. He also learned, through painful trial, the medicinal properties of the forest around him. A Dayak healer named Undi, an elderly woman from a longhouse 2 days upriver, taught him to identify the bark of the Kayu Gayang tree, which the Dayak people steeped into a bitter tea to reduce fever. Peter tested it carefully, on himself first, recording the dosage, the taste, the onset of effect, and the side effects. Stomach cramps at high concentration, drowsiness at moderate levels, genuine fever reduction at the dose Undi recommended. He noted everything in his field book. He also recorded his failures. The time he mistook a related bark for Kayu Gayang and spent 2 days vomiting, and the time he brewed a root tea that raised welts on his arms for a week. The jungle punishes hurry, he wrote, but it rewards attention. In March 1925, a girl named Sari arrived at the Sintang mission. She was 15, the orphaned daughter of a Malay trader and a Dayak mother, and she had walked for 6 days through jungle to reach the mission after her father's trading boat sank in a squall. She spoke Malay, Dayak Iban, and enough Dutch to argue with the mission teachers, which she did frequently and without apology. Father Janssen, recognizing a temperament that would not survive confinement, introduced her to Peter. They did not become friends immediately. Sari thought Peter was too quiet. Peter thought Sari asked too many questions, but when he showed her the field notebook, 2 years of observations, sketches, measurements, plant identifications, and construction details, she went silent for a long time, turning the pages with careful fingers. "You drew all of this?" she asked. "I wrote all of it," he said. "The drawings are just so I remember what I saw." Sari had skills Peter lacked. She could weave rattan into baskets and mats so tight they held water. She knew which river fish were safe to eat raw and which carried parasites. She could navigate by the sound of different bird calls and the direction of moss growth on tree trunks. She was also, Peter realized slowly, braver than he was, not in the sense of recklessness, but in the way she walked into unfamiliar situations without the hesitation that still sometimes froze him. They began working together at the second recovery station, building a bamboo and thatch sleeping ward that could hold 8 patients on raised platforms. Sari designed the lashing system for the roof beams using a double wrap technique she had learned from her mother that distributed weight more evenly than Peter's single wrap method. The roof held through 2 storms that would have collapsed his earlier designs. "You're better at this than I am," Peter told her one evening, watching her test a joint by hanging from it with her full weight. "I'm better at rattan," she said. "You're better at thinking about air." It was the most honest division of labor either of them had ever experienced. Groeneveld returned to Nangapino in June 1925, 2 years after he had abandoned Peter on the dock. His expedition had been a disaster: poor mapping, supply failures, a surveyor lost to fever, and debts owed to porters who refused to work for him again. He arrived at Lim's trading post, thin, bitter, and looking for someone to blame. He found instead that Peter Voss had become someone. The Dayak communities along the upper Kapuas knew Peter as Anak Hutan, the forest child, and they traded with him willingly, something they had never done with Groeneveld. Dr. Maas had written to the Colonial Health Office in Batavia, recommending Peter's ventilated shelter design for adoption at remote medical stations throughout Borneo. Father Janssen had submitted Peter's field notebook to the Royal Botanical Institute in Leiden, where a junior curator was transcribing his plant observations into formal Latin descriptions. Groeneveld stood on the dock at Nangapino and watched Peter paddle past in a dugout canoe, heading upriver to inspect the 3rd recovery station. Peter raised a hand in greeting. He did not stop. He did not gloat. He did not even slow down. Decker, the surveyor's assistant, who had once laughed at Peter's dismissal, had stayed behind in Pontianak with a case of malaria he could not shake. Groeneveld himself left Borneo 6 months later, having failed to secure new funding. Neither man's name appeared in the colonial health reports that followed. Peter's did. The years that followed settled into the rhythm that the jungle itself kept: wet and dry, flood and growth, loss and renewal. Peter and Shari built 7 more shelters over the next decade, each one better than the last. They married in 1929 in a ceremony at the Sintang mission that Father Janssen performed and that Lim attended, bringing a bolt of Chinese silk as a gift. They had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. The jungle was gentler than it had been, but it was never gentle. Peter continued his field notebooks. By 1940, He had filled 17 volumes with observations on Borneo's interior ecology, plant identifications, animal behavior, river flood cycles, soil composition, weather patterns, and detailed construction plans for ventilated shelters adapted to different terrain and climate conditions. Dr. Maas, who had returned to the Netherlands in 1932, arranged for copies to be deposited at the University of Leiden's Tropical Research Library. During the Japanese occupation of Borneo in 1942, Peter and Sari retreated into the deep interior with their children and a group of Dayak families who refused to submit to forced labor. The skills Peter had learned as a frightened 14-year-old, shelter, water, food, fire, patience, kept 17 people alive for 3 years in a hidden valley 12 days' walk from the nearest Japanese outpost. His eldest son, Jansen Voss, named for the mission priest, was 14 when they went into hiding. The boy built his first shelter that year, following his father's notebooks. The war ended. The Dutch colonial era ended. Indonesia was born. The jungle did not care about any of it. The rivers rose and fell. The canopy grew and shed. The limestone ridge where Peter had built his first platform still stood above the floodplain, though the ironwood trees were taller now, their buttress roots spreading wider with each decade. Peter Voss died on the 14th of September, 1971, at the age of 62. He had lived longer than most European men who spent their lives in the Borneo interior, and he attributed this, with characteristic understatement, to ventilation and clean water. He died in the shelter he and Sari had built on the ridge above the Kapuas tributary, the same ridge where he had counted 31 snakes on a flooded October night nearly 50 years before. The floor had been replaced 4 times, the roof 7 times, but the ironwood frame posts were original, and the limestone seep still ran clear and cold into a bamboo catch basin Sari had designed in 1930. His children and grandchildren were with him. Sari, who had been the braver of the two for nearly half a century, sat beside him and held his hand, which was scarred and calloused and still stained with the ink he used to write in his notebooks. "Keep looking," he told his grandson, a boy of 13 who had his grandfather's gray eyes and his grandmother's habit of asking too many questions. "The jungle always has more to show you, but you have to be still enough to see it." He closed his eyes. The afternoon breeze moved over the limestone and through the open wall of the shelter, carrying the green smell of rain coming up the valley. The last thing he felt was cool air on his face, the same cool air he had noticed as a frightened boy, the same air that had saved him and saved others and would go on moving through the gaps in the bamboo long after his name was forgotten. Epilogue. What the Jungle Keeps. Peter Voss's field notebooks remained at the University of Leiden until 1986, when a Dutch-Indonesian ecological survey team rediscovered them while researching traditional building techniques for tropical disease prevention. The team found that Peter's ventilated shelter designs, steep-pitched roofs, elevated bamboo floors with quarter-inch ventilation gaps, orientation toward prevailing breezes over exposed rock, anticipated principles of passive cooling that modern architects would not formalize until the late 20th century. The kayu gayung bark that Peter had documented, guided by the healer Undi, was identified by pharmacologists in 1993 as containing compounds with genuine antipyretic properties. The identification rested partly on Peter's careful dosage records, which noted effective concentrations alongside his own adverse reactions, a rigor uncommon in field ethnobotany of his era. Janssen Voss, Peter's eldest son, became a forestry officer in the newly independent Indonesia and spent his career advocating for the protection of upland jungle corridors. His sister, Undi Voss, named for the healer, trained as a nurse and established a mobile clinic that traveled the Upper Kapuas by longboat for 30 years. Their work carried different forms, but the same inheritance: pay attention, build carefully, respect what the forest offers. The limestone ridge above the Kapuas tributary still stands. The shelter is gone now. Thatch and bamboo returned to the soil within a few years, once human hands stopped maintaining them. But the ironwood posts remain upright, weathered to a silver gray that is harder than the stone beside them. The seep spring still flows, the breeze still moves across the limestone face and into the clearing where a boy once sat awake all night, holding a fish oil lamp steady, watching the snakes settle below him on dry ground and knowing, for the first time in his short and underestimated life, that what he had built was sound. The jungle keeps everything, seeds and bones and stone, but it also keeps the shape of attention, the marks a careful hand makes on bamboo, the angle of a roof that sheds rain correctly, the gap in a floor that lets air rise and keeps the crawling world below. Peter Voss was not the smartest person to enter the Borneo jungle, nor the strongest. He was the one who watched. And what he watched, he built. And what he built, he shared. The breeze still moves across the limestone. The cool air still rises through the gaps. There is always more to find.